Welcome to the HR on the Offensive podcast, brought to you by Lace Partners. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the latest HR on the Offensive podcast. It's me, Chris Howard from Lace Partners, joining you as always on this Thursday that we release our podcasts. Today we're talking a familiar topic to our campaigns that we've been running. We've been running at the beginning of this year, February, March time. We kicked off a campaign called Demystifying HR Operating Models. We have got a podcast that we're going to talk a little bit into somebody who is a HR magazine's most influential for 2024, and it's somebody that is a friend to Lace that we've known for some time. Before I introduce our HR's most influential thinker to the podcast, I'm going to get a co-host on, which is Kathy Akratopoulos, our Chief Executive Officer. Kathy, how are you doing? You all right?
I'm good, Chris. Good to be back.
Yeah, had to get you on this because this is your specialist subject, operating models, something that you love to chat on. We've had a few CPOs that we've talked to about it, haven't we? So it'd be good to have this conversation today.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to exploring it. It's one of my many soapboxes. We'll try and keep it in time, Chris.
We certainly will. Let's get our guest in. It's Melanie Steele, and Melanie has worked across a number of businesses. She's worked for LGC, Arab, Ariva, Boots. She's worked in change, in transformation, and as a CHRO. Mel, how are you doing? You all right?
I'm good. Good to see you, Chris. Good to see you, Kathy.
Lovely to have you with us now.
It's lovely to have you with us and talk about all things HR operating models. And Mel, obviously, you and I had a brief chat a few weeks ago at the time of recording just to talk about subjects that you might be interested in. And we talked about this campaign and you said, oh, yes, let's delve into that. So we'd love to get some of your perspective on all things to do with operating models and in the different businesses that you've worked in as well. But before we do that, let's do a quick intro so you can tell those listeners that are and maybe have not heard of you a little bit about your background, the types of work that you've done, just so that we kick that off, and then we'll get into one of my favourite bits of the pod, which is the fundamentally different questions. But Mel, tell our listeners a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, of course. So Melanie Steele, former HR director, currently now career interim. So I love going into different types of companies, helping them with their people change and transformation agendas. Although of late been doing a little bit of fractional HR work as well. So all strings to my bow. In terms of organisations, lots of different types. So I started off my career in the public sector. So I had a lot of experience, and then more of late in private sector, different types of organisations, many you listed already, Chris, and also non-exec director as well. So nice, varied, different career that I've had and continue to have in the future.
Yeah, and I think that's why I wanted to get you on and talk about this, because of the business drivers. And what I'm going to do in a minute, I'm going to get Kathy just to give a quick overview of each of the different business drivers, just a 1 minute so that we can frame it. And then we'll talk to you a little bit around your perception of businesses that you've worked in, how it's differed and things like that. But first, fundamentally different question time. Article today, Kathy, we give our guest a few seconds to compose herself. But fundamentally different question from me today is, I've read an article where there's a man who has been building very large versions of household items. So he's built, on the picture that I saw, he's built a really massive plug. It's sort of the size of a human torso. Very, very strange indeed. But my random question for you today, I'll go first to give you a second as well, is if you could have one household item that this man could build for you, what would it be? Now, mine would be a really large key drawer, or things that you stick all of your rubbish in, like old receipts or pound coins and things like that, because ours is absolutely full to the brim. So I would get a really large version of those so I can fill more of our stuff in. What would yours be, Kathy?
Well, I think it's quite weird in terms of what you've seen in the press, Chris. I haven't seen this one. You're going to have to send me the link. So what a random question today, but that's the point, I guess. For me, I would go for like a human-sized adult, let's say 6 foot tall remote control, because we're always losing it. And if I manage to lose a 6-foot tall remote control, then something's wrong with the world. So I'd like to have that in my sitting room so I always know where it is.
I love that. And can you imagine saying to your husband or your kids, can you just pass the remote? And they're like, no, you're going to have to get up and come and get it, because this thing's massive.
Exactly.
I love it. Mel, come on. What would yours be?
Oh, what a random question. I should have expected that from Lace Partners, shouldn't I? I think I would do like a really big life size, like shoe storage, because even though I think it's so obvious, and there's only me and my husband that live here, right? I think it's so obvious where you put shoes, you go in, we've got a little cubby hole, you just take them off and put in there. Some reason he still seems to think I put them right by the door. And because they're so big, he's a big guy, 6'6", that I trip over them. So maybe if it was as big as him, this as he came through the door, that he'd have no excuse but to take his shoes off and put them there. So I noticed Kathy and I both went for the practical application way. So that's probably where this podcast will go a little bit, right?
Yeah, and that is exactly where we're going to do. Mine is more around for my own benefit, so I like it. I do like those options. So we've got a large key drawer, we've got a large remote control, and a large shoe rack. Lovely. Right, Kathy, let's do a little bit of framing on the campaign, because we've been running this campaign of demystifying HR operating models. It's all focused on trying to simplify it for organizations and the perception, like what is an operating model? Why should you demystify it? And we've gone into a whole litany of different blogs, articles, pieces. What I wanted to focus on today specifically was the business drivers piece. So can you, for our audience, before we then get Mel's take, just give us maybe a 1 minute on each of the 4 business drivers?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, this came from the premise that one size doesn't fit all, right, when it comes to HR operating models. You know, a lot of organizations will say we have the Ulrich model or we have the Gartner model, whatever it is, right? And I guess our perspective at Lace is one model is probably not going to work for every organization. And therefore, we took the view of actually what should drive the operating model, and our perspective will be the business context, right? And the way the business runs itself needs to drive the operating model, as well as the employee experience and the other angles that make the operating model successful. Therefore, we applied 4 business lenses, which may well lead to a differentiated operating model. And the 4 were around agility. So if an organization is constantly changing, reshaping, rethinking what it's doing, needing to be able to respond and rapidly evolve, you may well need an organizational model for your HR function, a set of capabilities that's different, maybe in a more stable organization in terms of how you support business transformation, basically, and embed that within your operating model. Maybe you're an organization that's all about customer intimacy and customer experience. In those scenarios, you may well need an operating model that enables that customer intimacy and aligns the business and the HR function to be as close to the customer as possible and aligned to those customer outcomes, and particularly the link between employee experience and customer experience. The third one is around the pursuit of growth. So in a rapid growth organization, whatever its starting scale, if it's looking to grow rapidly, double in size or whatever it is, then actually you need an HR operating model that's set up to deliver on that with an infrastructure that not only supports the multiple sort of hiring activity you're going to be going through, but also has an HR model that is a platform so you can expand the HR function as you grow. And the final one is around a focus on productivity. So actually, if you're a business that maybe is in a low margin, high volume business, or that you're looking to drive efficiency across the business, how can you ensure that you are doing things well in the most efficient way possible to deliver outcomes? So those were the 4 sort of business contexts. Now, clearly, a business may have more than one of those that's relevant, but understanding that and understanding what you're trying to achieve as a business should be a primary driver for the HR operating model design.
Lovely. So Mel, wanted to get your initial take on businesses that you've worked in. I guess let's start with a nice, easy, general one. Do those drivers kind of resonate with organizations that you've worked in and the different ones on them? Or were there any areas that you think perhaps are slightly different, or there's been a blending perhaps of those approaches?
Yeah, I mean, I like the term demystify as well. I think HR operating model feels a bit cold. The word operating model in itself, doesn't it, feels a bit cold. But what I particularly like, and I've been listening to the podcast and reading some of the stuff over the last few months on this that Lace have been talking about, is I have a real bad aversion to people coming out saying this is the HR operating model. And I shout at the piece of paper, the podcast, whatever, going, how can one size fits all, so that's without being prompted from Kathy at all on it. And I think what I like about this is it's like a framework. I mean, I always love a framework in a sense, but I mean from a practical side of things, somewhere to start, because I think sometimes it's not the HR functions that's deciding to do this. Typically it can start because of the productivity, the cost control type conversations. So definitely have been in those. More of late, it's been companies that have grown through acquisition, so that growth thing, but not really too clear on that growth, but everyone just tells you wherever you go, we're growing. It feels a little bit like unstructured, but the world of PE is always up and open, and suddenly they turn up and they're going to do a deal. That's kind of where that comes from. The customer experience one, I think, is interesting. I think we've seen more organizations really wrestle with that in the front line of their business. So I think it's great that they can kind of turn their hand to, this is what the business is going after, so this is how we need to align our total operating model with our HR operating model, because the two can't sit independently, right? And the agility one, I guess less so, but I think we're going to see probably more of that as time goes on, or maybe that kind of cross between agility and productivity. We've got to kind of keep focused on the here and now, and we've got cost pressures, and we need to transform with limited investment, which seems to be kind of the play at the moment that a lot of business are wrestling with. So yeah.
I mean, I think all of that echoes really well, Mel, in terms of the nature of the business environment. And I guess that's the point of our framework, really, is to say that getting under the skin of the business and understanding its drivers over the next few years and what it's trying to achieve. To your point, you can't design the op model for HR in isolation. It needs to be there to achieve business outcomes, and actually being clear on what those business outcomes are and thinking therefore about the capabilities that you need in an HR function, not necessarily at an individual level, but as a functional set of capabilities, is key. I wonder, in terms of the operating model components, from your experience, let's take one of them. So you're talking about productivity, for example, and a drive for efficiency. What sort of examples, and obviously I'm not looking for you to name particular companies here, Mel, I know you've worked in lots, but maybe anonymised. When an organisation is looking to drive efficiency, where have you seen that sort of take a hit or enable a CPO or yourself to sort of go in and say, actually, we need to do things differently if we're going to drive efficiency or productivity better through HR?
Yeah, I think typically where I've been involved, they've probably taken that big decision that they need to do some cost savings, but probably haven't even thought through what does that mean in terms of the different functional areas. Sometimes they've started in finance. That's always an interesting one, I think, when finance has gone first, or they're kind of a little bit ahead of the game. Someone then talks about HR and about should we be looking at HR at the same time. And then there's always this tendency usually to let's just lift and shift what we've done in finance and just roll it across to HR operating model. And we know that some of that might work at that more transactional level with processes and such like, but when we come to then that more value add side of things, that's when you kind of have to, I think, take a step back and go, okay, what is it we're trying to achieve here in totality with the business? Yes, we need to drive down costs, but what we don't want to happen, and I have seen this done in other organizations, is they might decide to go for a business services center, so everything, whether that's outsourced, insourced, etc. They haven't thought about the managers as part of that, where they are today and where they need to be in the future. And what happens is they kind of strip out a lot of the HR folk that have been on the ground. And what you see is the business not being able to survive necessarily in what's gone from what I call quite an extreme operating model change without a lot of change support that's gone with it. And a shadow HR function almost pops up. So what you have is people going back in to kind of fill the gap, but you've got a worse scenario now because they're not practitioner probably level. They're not kind of grouped as part of the HR function. And then you've got what I call well well-meaning, gifted amateurs in the business trying to fill that gap that's been left behind from HR. So that's where I've seen it, like, maybe, and I typically go in on the back of some of that where they say, hey, this is not working, we don't understand why, help us to kind of make it work.
Yeah, I think that really resonates actually, Mel, where you started that sort of piece there around alignment with finance, I think is a really interesting point, right? And let's come back to the sort of change and impact on the managers as well to explore those points as well, because I think they're all very valid. I've seen that too, right? Where actually if you're looking for efficiencies across a business, if we're playing the productivity angle, then sometimes it's the CFO that's initiating a lot of the change, right? Because it may be CEO, CFO led. Okay, let's do some benchmarking. Let's just understand as a business our cost base and where we can drive some savings from a cost reduction perspective. And obviously then the other angle is how you uplift productivity that goes with that. And that can lead to sort of quite sweeping changes across all support functions, right, around their operating model. And as you rightly say, often the core structure of how you organize finance functions and HR functions tends to be similar in that you will have some form of centralized service center, you will have some form of automation, you will have some form of business partnering, finance and HR, aligning to the business leaders and how they make decisions. But I think that then there's a distinction, right? And you make that really important distinction around actually, whilst that may drive efficiency, ultimately the value add aspect of HR's role in the business may not be able to come to the fore in that sort of model, where you may not have the capacity or the capabilities in that model to drive business change, for example, or to support large-scale initiatives or be agile as one of our other lenses, right, to respond to different changes. So that really resonates. And often when I'm working with clients, it is that sort of, well, when you talk about the HR function, you start with, well, how is finance organised? And where is finance going with this? Because if you look at it from a business leader point of view, they've got a finance partner and they've got an HR partner. If the scope of those roles or the way they operate or where they're based or how much time they get from them differs, you'd sort of have a challenge then, right, as a business leader as to where you get that sort of transformational support from. In that sort of scenario, those are the sorts of challenges you've seen, and that if you're going for efficiency too much, maybe we can dig into that a bit more, the impact that has on what HR can't do or what the business then can't do. What sort of challenges have come out of that where you've seen that?
I think it's probably the main difference is that role of the line manager as well. So typically in finance, when you do the automation type side of things, filling in your expenses and lots of things like that, doing your forecasts, it's pretty self-serve. You can understand some of that side of things. Obviously, where businesses may have had managers who have been being propped up, if I say that in a nice way, by HR. I believe managers should manage people, but the reality is in a lot of businesses, even now, HR have been very good in some ways of being able to fill the gap of maybe where some managers don't perform as to the level that they should with their people responsibility. So that kind of drastic change, what I've seen, is without that recognition that this is a really big step change for us, in not just in terms of our operating model. Yes, we'll drive efficiencies, but the unintended consequences sometimes to that efficiency is that we've got a lot of managers who we think should be doing certain things, which I don't disagree with, but without any upskilling, without acknowledging that and saying that out loud, and really having a campaign, a change behind that to make that culture shift, actually I've seen, can be incredibly damaging to the business, and almost in one of the businesses I work with had brought it to a bit of a halt. There was just holes appearing everywhere in the day-to-day running of their people side of it. They were a people business too in that sense, and they just made some big assumptions and had gone from a very in-house, I would call it, model to something that had worked for finance in the main. There were some expenses that weren't paid on time, that kind of thing, but in the main it was fine. But as soon as they pulled HR into that as well, it had really bad unintended consequences, to the point that they were then working out, how do we reverse back from this position?
Yeah, and that can sort of have knock-on impacts on the overall goal, which is around productivity, right? In terms of if your teams aren't being managed particularly well, are they achieving what they need to do? Are they having great experiences at work? Do they feel engaged? Do they feel positive about their roles, right? Because the role of a manager is so key.
This is an interesting one because as you guys are talking, I was just starting to think about, you're talking about change and you're talking about change within two different functions. But one of the questions that I wanted to pose, it might actually be one I'd like to get your opinion on as well, Kathy, is how often organizations should be thinking about looking at their operating model, adapting their operating model, evolving their operating model, and what you've seen, I guess, what does good look like now and what does it done badly look like? Because too much change, if you even think from a line manager perspective, too much constant change, talking about align to what your business drivers are. But if your business drivers are constantly evolving, then your operating model needs to naturally evolve as well. But then I guess my original point to stop this turning into a rambling monologue is how much change is too much change when it comes to evolving, developing, broadening out, changing your operating model.
I would say you don't want to be transforming every week, that it brings disruption to any business, right? But there's a bigger goal. So typically when I'm working with a client, they are very focused on getting from A to B. So I call that initial kind of big change. I'm always really keen to kind of set out what happens beyond that. So levels of maturity of the operating model, because typically what I found is obviously everyone's very focused on that initial change and it takes a lot of energy, a lot of work. I talked about something where typically I go in when things haven't necessarily worked or they're starting from the beginning, because by nature in what I do, I'm helping them to deliver some things. But where it's gone well, actually what you've done is really changed that culture in the organization. So I can remember being with an organization who said it will never work to get people to self-serve when it comes to people related issues, because they've got to talk to a person. I'm older now, as you know, but it wasn't a billion years ago we were having these conversations. And then of course they did it really well, it landed well. And then I can remember being in the meeting and the guy's like, well, this is great, but what next? They'd almost taken that big step change. It wasn't without pain, but they did it well. They did it underpinned with great change management and support, and they were on a roll. And I think having an understanding of that continuous improvement, I guess is what I like to call it, is that you're never going to then stand still thereafter. So typically I've been in organizations and said, well, we haven't really changed things for 10 years. My kind of thing to them is, well, now you're on this pathway. You need to think about this as levels of maturity, how you can continue to grow, because with technical advancement, there's going to be more opportunity to do more. So this isn't big bang change. This is evolution, I guess, in it. So it becomes more subtle, and individuals, they just expect it. It's happening in day-to-day life. And if you get it really right, there's a big pull. So from your customer base, they're like, hey, is there any chance now we can have this, this, and this? Because I've got X, but I'd really like Y. So having them really involved, the services that you're delivering and being able to become more efficient is a real feasible piece. I think, as you build the capability of the business to be able to experience these services different, and the capability of the HR function, because I think the two things go hand in hand, you can then really look at how you continue to ensure that the operating model is developing. I like to call it developing rather than changing, aligned to the business, because the business isn't going to stand still. It's going to be looking at different things, and it's having that fleet of foot to be able to respond to that without having to do big bang change. Yeah. I still think they need us to help them with that. I'm not trying to talk myself out that you don't need expertise to do these things, but I hope there's enough, they can do enough for themselves that they do it on an evolution basis.
Yeah, I like that. Kathy, I want to get your views on this as well. But I mean, as you were talking then, Mel, a really good example that's popping into my head is if you think about the way people are talking about how AI is going to impact the way in which we work, that is potentially going to be for some people, for some functions, for some businesses, that's going to have a big impact. But for some, perhaps less of an impact. And there's a debate around that could fundamentally change the way in which we do a lot of the work that we do. And so that evolution maybe is just part of it. And perhaps your operating model needs to, it just, as you said, it's that evolution piece. But Kathy, same question, I guess, which was originally it was how much change is too much change, and this idea of a continuously evolving operating model. Get some thoughts on that from you, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I agree with everything that Mel said, right? I think for me, if we think about our drivers of the right HR operating model for a particular business, there's two primary drivers. There's the business context, which we talked around, right? And those business lenses, and that will change over time potentially. And so whenever any of that fundamentally shifts, I think there is a need to look wholesale at the operating model. Now, if it's a successful business, I wouldn't expect that to be too often, right? But if there are fundamental shifts in where the business is focused and what it's driving, then that automatically lends itself to say, well, as a support function, as an enabling function for the business, how do we need to do things differently in HR? The second driver is the people outcomes, right? So what are we trying to achieve as a people function on behalf of the business? Again, if that fundamentally shifts, then maybe we need to look at our operating model, the core capabilities that we need. So I think those two to me are the major drivers that would trigger a more wholesale sort of revisit of, are we set up to deliver in that business context, those business outcomes and or the people outcomes if they fundamentally changed. But aside from that, to me, I like the continuous improvement focus, right? So how can we continuously evolve the way we deliver services, the services that we do deliver, the tech that we're using, the capabilities that we have as a business, and the people management capabilities within the business? How can that continually improve and evolve? Which to me is sort of something about never resting on our laurels, right? In an HR function, having the data, the insights, the feedback that says, how are we doing? And continuing to use that to drive new initiatives, new ways of improving, rather than a wholesale shift again.
Yeah, and just linked to that, and again, we've got just a minute or two, but I want to get both of your views on this. Just linked to what you were just talking about there, Kathy. How do you then measure success? I want to get some views on you. So how do we measure what we're doing and the approach that we're making? And Kathy, you were talking about using data, and obviously a part of that is going to be, how do you actually measure it to work out what good looks like? So Mel, just some views from you, and then Kathy, just to wrap us up. So question really is, how do you actually measure the success of your operating model or the work that you're doing and its evolution?
I think, well, landing it in the first place, doing that big change, it does amaze me. But have you achieved what you set out to do initially? Why were you doing that change? You can lose that because it can be quite, it feels like a pretty difficult journey sometimes, and everyone just wants to move past it. But it is really important to go back to, why did you do that change initially? Have you met the initial objectives? So that alignment typically with the business goals that Kathy talked about is obviously context. I think you've got to look at the operational efficiency of it by making the change. No one does change typically without hoping that there's some financial gain. And, looking at the cost of a function is a good thing to do. I often, first thing I'll do, because it's interesting how much different functions cost. Typically, actually, HR is sometimes it's not bad bung for what it gets. So, I like to measure, the cost side, and then, you have the smaller indicators. So looking at a mix of leading and lag indicators, which HR obviously contributed to, time to hire, that kind of stuff. I think what's always important to me is that leader/employee experience. And yes, it's great to have the qualitative side of things, the response times, but really that quantitative of feedback from managers when they go through something. How was it? Did they feel supported? Are we getting that right connection through? Because it can make such a big difference to feeling that you may not have got the outcome that you desire, but as you went through the process, and the support you got, was it right? Did it help the business? And I am a big fan of the measuring of the HR capability. So Kathy talked about that functional, but also on an individual. If you're really going to ensure this model is right for the future, actually thinking about what capabilities do you need today and tomorrow, and making sure individuals are looking at their own development and staying relevant, understanding AI, what's the advantages, why it's probably not the panacea to all of our problems in the future. Having a view and a voice on this stuff also helps, I think, elevate that level of maturity of the function and the conversations in the future.
Yeah. And Kathy, just as we wrap up today, any kind of final thoughts, either builds on that or just general thoughts around how you actually measure success?
Yeah, and I think there's different levels of measurement, right? So as a CPO sitting around a C-suite, there will be some major people KPIs that are relevant for the whole of the C-suite, right? So there'll be ways in which you're assessing how are we doing when it comes to our people. And I guess, whilst the HR function isn't accountable for all of that, it contributes to it and is a major driver of focus on those areas. So to me, there's what you might show your C-suite of a small number of critical measures that everyone associates with driving business value. I think that is sort of one set of measures at that level. Within the function itself, I think absolutely there are measures that functionally drive, the cost, the efficiency, the productivity of the function, time to serve, and feedback on service provision will be critical. And some elements of the model are easier to measure that than others. So a service centre environment, will lend itself, hopefully, to a continuous source of data on how did we do, as well as the time it takes to complete services or processes, and how much of that was deemed to be helpful or not helpful from the recipient of the service. But other elements like business partnering or COE function is less easy, right? Sometimes to feedback on how are we doing, and that's where maybe having more active listening channels or feedback channels with the individual parts of the business who those people interact with, I think is also helpful. So business leaders who've got HR business partners sitting around their table, how valuable is that input? That's something that isn't often measured. COEs, how effective were our solutions and our policies that we designed? Again, not something that's so easy to measure. So I think you look within the function itself, impact on the business, and then what are the things that actually the C-suite really need to focus on.
Yeah, absolutely love that. We are out of time, unfortunately, for today, because this has been a really, really interesting chat to get both of your perspectives on the different types of operating models, how they evolve, how you measure them. Kathy, thank you very much for co-hosting.
Pleasure, Chris, and lovely to see you again, Mel.
Yep. Yeah. Lovely to have you on.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Of course, you can get access to all of our back catalogue of podcasts and any of our content. You can find out more about the actual campaign itself. We've got videos, we've got blog pieces, we've got some framework and some thoughts around the different models that we've got, including talking about the 4 hats or the different types of hats that CPO wears and how that differs across the different operating model business drivers. So check that out and find out a little bit more details on the Lace Partners website. But from myself, from Kathy and from Mel, thank you very much. And hopefully we'll catch you next time on the HR on the Offensive podcast. Bye-bye.